The Geiger counter clicks. Not fast, just steady. You're walking through what used to be a children's playground, and the swings are still moving in the wind, and there's a teddy bear on the ground that someone dropped 200 years ago. The clicking gets louder near the slide. Somewhere in the distance, a feral ghoul is screaming, but it's far enough away that you don't run. You just keep walking, because in the Fallout universe, radiation and horror and the slow realization that humanity destroyed itself are just part of the landscape now. Tonight we're going deeper than super mutants and death claws. We're digging into the secrets that expose what the Great War really was, what happened in the moments before the bombs fell, and the cosmic and corporate horrors that most players walk past without noticing, the alien obsessions that make no sense, the cults that worship things that shouldn't exist, the possibility that the nuclear apocalypse wasn't an act of war but an act of profit, and the victims who became something else entirely, their bodies and minds transformed by forces that blur the line between science and nightmare. By the time we're done, you'll understand that Fallout's true horror isn't the wasteland. It's what created the wasteland and what's still waiting in the ruins, patient and hungry and older than the bombs. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's begin. The question that haunts the wasteland. October 23rd, 2077. The morning starts normal enough. People go to work, children eat breakfast. Someone somewhere is planning a birthday party, and then, at 9:47 in the morning, detection systems across the United States register incoming ICBMs from China. 4 minutes of warning. 4 minutes to process that everything you know is about to end. The missiles launch in response. China burns, America burns. The world becomes ash and radiation and 2 centuries of slow dying. But here's the question that won't let go. Who actually fired first? And more disturbingly, what if the answer isn't China or the United States, but a corporation that spent decades building underground vaults and had every reason to make sure those vaults would be needed? The official narrative is straightforward enough. The resource wars had been draining every nation for decades. Oil dried up. Uranium became the most valuable substance on Earth. China invaded Alaska to secure those resources. The United States annexed Canada to create a buffer and to secure their own supplies. The war ground on for years, conventional at first, then increasingly desperate. By October of 2077, the United States had pushed China back, reclaimed Alaska, and was actually invading mainland China. The People's Liberation Army was losing badly. So the common assumption runs like this. China faced total defeat. Their options were surrender or escalation. They chose mutually assured destruction. They launched everything they had, knowing the United States would retaliate, knowing it meant the end of civilization. A final act of desperation from a nation that couldn't accept losing, but that explanation has cracks when you examine it closely. China was losing, yes, but losing enough to guarantee their own extinction? The United States was winning the conventional war. They had momentum. They had Alaska back, but they were also exhausted, stretched thin, fighting on multiple fronts. Would China really choose species-level suicide over negotiated surrender? Would they really burn the world rather than accept terms? On the other side, the United States had no strategic benefit from launching first. They were winning. Why trigger nuclear exchange when conventional victory seemed achievable? It makes no sense from a military perspective. But then you look at Vault-Tec, and suddenly the calculus changes entirely. Vault-Tec had spent more than a decade building fallout shelters across America, massive underground installations, each one costing billions, funded by government contracts and private investment. They'd sold the American public on the promise of safety, run endless advertisements showing happy families descending into vaults while mushroom clouds bloomed behind them. They'd positioned themselves as humanity's salvation in the event of nuclear war. But here's the problem with that business model. If nuclear war never comes, all those vaults are just expensive holes in the ground. All that investment, all those contracts, all that infrastructure becomes worthless. Vault-Tec's entire business empire was predicated on the bombs actually falling. And by 2077, it was starting to look like they might not. Peace talks were happening. Back channels between the United States and China were exploring de-escalation. The resource wars were devastating, but both nations were exhausted. There were factions in both governments pushing for negotiated settlement. The war might actually end without going nuclear. That would be catastrophic for Vault-Tec. Documents from before the war show that Vault-Tec didn't just prepare for nuclear conflict. They actively sabotaged peace efforts. They lobbied against diplomatic solutions. They had representatives embedded in government and military structures whose job was ensuring that tensions stayed high, that compromise remained impossible, that the path to nuclear war stayed open. Why would a corporation do this? Because they'd already committed. The vaults were built. The money was spent. The only way those investments paid off was if the world actually ended. The Fallout television series revealed something that confirmed what many had suspected for years. In a meeting between Vault-Tec executives and other corporate leaders, a Vault-Tec representative explicitly discusses their plan. If nuclear war doesn't happen naturally, they'll drop the first bomb themselves. They'll manufacture the apocalypse they've been preparing for, take control of the aftermath, and rebuild civilization according to their own design. They'd have a complete monopoly on survival infrastructure. Everyone who lived through the initial exchange would owe Vault-Tec their continued existence. The show doesn't definitively confirm that Vault-Tec actually launched first. It shows they were willing to, shows they'd planned to, but stops short of showing them pressing the button. And here's where it gets complicated. Tim Kaine, one of the original creators of Fallout, has previously confirmed that China fired first. That's canon from the game's original vision. China launched the first nukes, America retaliated, and both nations destroyed each other. So how do you reconcile these two pieces of information? The original creator says China started it. The television series shows Vault-Tec planning to start it. There's a theory that threads the needle. What if Vault-Tec didn't physically launch the first missiles, but they created the conditions that made China launch? What if they infiltrated Chinese detection systems and triggered a false alarm that made China's leadership believe American nukes were already in the air? China would think they were retaliating, would believe they were launching defensive strikes, but they'd actually be firing first based on manufactured intelligence. Vault-Tec had the technology. They had deep connections to military and intelligence networks on both sides of the conflict through corporate espionage and backdoor deals. They had the motivation, and they had the ruthlessness, as proven by what they did with the vaults after the war started. Because here's the thing that makes Vault-Tec's guilt undeniable, regardless of who physically launched first. The vaults were never meant to save people. They were designed as experiment chambers. Social experiments, medical experiments, psychological torture disguised as research protocols. Vault-Tec knew the bombs were coming, convinced the government to fund their construction, then used them to conduct research that would have been illegal in any functioning society. Vault 12 in Necropolis was designed with a door that wouldn't seal properly, exposing residents to radiation to study ghoulification. Vault 27 was deliberately overpopulated to breaking point to study social collapse. Vault 111 kept residents in cryogenic suspension and murdered them one by one for research. Vault 77 had only one man and a box full of puppets to study isolation psychosis. The vaults weren't salvation, they were laboratories, and the people who sought shelter in them were test subjects who never consented to the experiments they'd be subjected to. So even if China technically launched first, even if Vault-Tec didn't physically press the button, they're still responsible. They created the economic and political conditions that made war inevitable. They sabotaged every effort at peace. They built infrastructure designed not to save humanity, but to experiment on survivors. And they planned explicitly and in documented meetings to launch themselves if no one else did. Vault-Tec needed the apocalypse. They built their entire corporate strategy around it. They made it inevitable through sabotage and manipulation, and when the bombs fell, they were ready, waiting in their control vaults while millions burned. The Great War wasn't a tragic miscalculation or an act of desperate nations. It was profitable. Someone made money on the end of the world. Someone turned species-level extinction into a business opportunity. And that corporation is still operating in the wasteland, still running experiments, still treating human suffering as an acceptable research cost. That's the first secret. The apocalypse wasn't an accident. It was an investment. And it paid off exactly as planned. The alien shrine to a child's toy. The Zetans had been watching Earth for centuries. Their motherships orbited in the dark, observing, abducting, experimenting. They'd been taking humans since at least the 16th century, keeping some as specimens, studying others, dissecting their technology and culture with detached, scientific curiosity. By the time the bombs fell in 2077, the Zetans had accumulated hundreds of years of data about humanity. But of all the things they'd observed, all the technology they'd analyzed, all the cultural artifacts they'd collected, one object became the focus of something that can only be described as worship: a giddy-up buttercup, a child's animatronic riding toy, a mechanical horse, manufactured by Wilson Automatoys, sold in department stores across America, plastic and circuits and springs, designed to make children giggle while it bucked and trotted in place. When you explore Mothership Zeta in Fallout 3, you find something inexplicable. A circular chamber deep in the ship and at its center, placed on a pedestal, surrounded by what looks unmistakably like religious iconography, sits a giddy-up buttercup. The room is decorated like a shrine. The positioning of objects around it suggests ritual significance. The Zetans aren't just storing this toy, they're venerating it. What the hell is going on here? The Zetans are supposed to be advanced. Their technology makes pre-war human science look primitive. They have faster-than-light travel, energy weapons beyond anything humanity developed, biological manipulation capabilities that border on the impossible. And they're worshipping a children's toy. Sally, one of the human abductees aboard Mothership Zeta, provides a single clue. She was taken shortly after the Great War, a child when the aliens abducted her, and she's been aboard the ship ever since, kept alive through Zetan technology. She tells you that once she approached the giddy-up buttercup shrine. She was just a kid, saw a familiar toy from home, felt drawn to it. And when she got close, when she reached out toward it, the Zetans reacted with extreme agitation. They didn't hurt her, but they were intensely focused on her interaction with the object, watching with what seemed like excitement, or anticipation, or something she couldn't quite identify. That's all we know. That one observation from a confused child who couldn't understand why the aliens cared so much about a toy horse. The theories sprawl in every direction. Do the Zetans believe Giddy-Up Buttercup is a human deity? Did they observe children playing with these toys, see the joy and attention humans gave them, and misinterpret that cultural behavior as religious worship? Alien anthropology filtered through incomprehensible cognitive frameworks might produce exactly this kind of cargo cult response. They see humans treasuring these objects, assume the objects themselves hold power, and replicate the worship without understanding its context. Or did the Zetans discover something about the Giddy-Up Buttercup that humans never realized? The toys were everywhere in pre-war America, mass-produced, distributed to millions of homes. What if they were manufactured using some element or process that the Zetans recognize as significant? What if there's something in the atomic components, some resonance in the mechanical systems, some quantum property in the circuitry that humans couldn't detect but that registers as important to Zetan sensors? There's a darker possibility. What if the Giddy-Up Buttercup resembles something from Zetan culture? some entity or symbol from their own history or mythology that humans accidentally recreated through pure coincidence of design. The horse shape, the mechanical movement, the specific proportions triggered recognition in the Zetan mind of something significant from their own cosmology. They're not worshipping a human toy. They're worshipping what that toy resembles, seeing in it an echo of something from their own distant past or their own religious traditions. Or, most disturbingly, what if the Zetans are right? What if there is something genuinely significant about Giddy Up Buttercup that no human ever discovered? What if these mass-produced children's toys contain or represent something that justified worship from a species millions of years more advanced than humanity? The game never tells you. The shrine exists. The Zetans tend it. Sally witnessed their reaction. And that's all the information you get. The rest is speculation and unease. This is cosmic horror in its purest form. Not a monster you can fight, not a threat you can understand, but an encounter with intelligence so alien that its motivations and beliefs are fundamentally inaccessible to human comprehension. The Zetans have reasons for what they do. Those reasons make sense within their framework of understanding reality. But that framework is so distant from human thought that we can't even begin to parse it. You walk through Mothership Zeta, fighting alien soldiers, rescuing abductees, destroying ship systems. You can complete the entire DLC, but you never understand the shrine. You never learn why they worship a child's toy. You never get closure on that central mystery. And that not knowing is more disturbing than any explanation could be, because it means there are layers of reality operating around us that we can't perceive, significances we can't recognize, meanings that exist but remain forever inaccessible to human consciousness. The Zetans saw something in Giddy Up Buttercup that made them build a shrine. Centuries of observing humanity, analyzing human culture, studying human behavior, and this plastic horse became sacred to them. Maybe they know something we don't. Maybe there's something about those toys, something woven into their manufacturing or their purpose or their existence that we've never noticed because we're looking at them from the wrong frame of reference. Or maybe the horror is simpler. Maybe the Zetans are just as confused and frightened and lost as humanity is, grasping for meaning in a universe that doesn't provide it, building shrines to things they don't understand because even advanced intelligence needs something to believe in when faced with the infinite void. Either way, somewhere in orbit around Earth, on a Zetan mothership, a Giddy Up Buttercup sits in a circular chamber being worshipped by entities that have traveled between stars, and no one knows why. The ghoul cults and the Elder Thing. You descend into the Dunwich building in the capital wasteland, and immediately something feels wrong. The air is heavier. The shadows move differently. You start seeing things that shouldn't be there. Hallucinations of people who aren't really present. Flickering visions of the building as it was before the war. The deeper you go, the worse it gets. Feral ghouls roam the corridors, but they're not behaving like typical ferals. They're gathered in specific locations. They're positioned around objects with what looks like intentionality. And when you reach the lowest level, beneath the offices, deep in tunnels that shouldn't exist, you find them congregated around a massive obelisk covered in strange markings. They're worshipping it. Feral ghouls don't worship. They don't demonstrate complex behavior beyond basic survival instinct and aggression. Their cognitive functions have deteriorated to the point where organized religion should be impossible. But here they are, gathered in something that looks unmistakably like prayer or veneration, focused on an obelisk dedicated to an entity called Ugg Qualtoth. This same pattern appears in Fallout 4 at the Dunwich Borers, a quarry in Massachusetts. You descend into the excavation site and experience similar reality distortions. Hallucinations show you the quarry as it was before the war. You witness fragments of a ritual performed on the day the bombs fell. And at the bottom, surrounded by more feral ghouls arranged in positions of worship, you find another shrine. A massive stone face buried in the earth, something that was there long before the Dunwich Borers Company started digging, something they were specifically looking for. The terminal entries you find reveal that Dunwich Borers wasn't a normal mining operation. The company's leadership knew something was down there. They chose this location specifically because of the entity buried beneath it. They excavated carefully, deliberately, searching for something they already believed existed, and when they found it, they performed rituals, blood offerings, occult ceremonies. The manager and workers transformed into ghouls immediately when the bombs fell, possibly even before the radiation reached them, as though something in the ritual or the presence of the buried thing changed them directly. Ugg-Qualtoth is referenced across multiple games, connected to the Dunwich Company, linked to locations where reality behaves strangely and ghouls gather to worship. This is Fallout's Lovecraftian element, its acknowledgement that beneath the science fiction wasteland there are older things, entities that predate humanity, forces that exist outside the boundaries of understood reality. The name itself is a reference. Ugg-Qualtoth echoes Yog-Sothoth, one of H.P. Lovecraft's outer gods, an entity that exists outside normal space and time. The Dunwich references connect to Lovecraft's story, The Dunwich Horror. The game is deliberately invoking cosmic horror traditions, importing them into Fallout's universe, and suggesting that the Great War and the Wasteland are not the deepest layer of horror present in this world. But here's what makes it disturbing beyond mere reference. The ghoulification process is scientific. It's caused by radiation exposure. We understand the mechanism, at least broadly. Massive doses of radiation cause cellular changes that some humans survive while others don't. Those who survive with cognitive functions intact become sentient ghouls. Those whose brains degrade become feral. So why do feral ghouls worship? Why do they gather at specific shrines to Ugg-Qualtoth with behavior that suggests purpose and meaning they shouldn't be capable of? One possibility, Ugg-Qualtoth, whatever it is, has some connection to the ghoulification process itself. Maybe the radiation doesn't just change bodies. Maybe it makes certain humans perceivable to entities like Ugg-Qualtoth, opens a channel between ghoul consciousness and something vast and old that exists in dimensions normal humans can't access. Ferals lose their human cognition, but they gain something else, awareness of presences that the rest of us are blind to. The worship isn't learned behavior, it's an instinctive response to perceiving something that compels acknowledgement. Another possibility, Ugg-Qualtoth can influence feral ghouls directly in ways it cannot influence normal humans. Their degraded cognitive state makes them susceptible to external control or suggestion from entities that operate on non-material planes. The ferals aren't worshipping by choice. They're being puppeted, positioned around shrines by something that needs specific arrangements of specific types of beings for purposes we can't comprehend. Or maybe it's simpler and worse. Maybe Ugg-Qualtoth is somehow responsible for ghoulification itself. The radiation is the mechanism, but there's something else involved, something that predates the bombs, that has been waiting beneath the earth for centuries or millennia. When the Great War irradiated millions of humans, that entity saw an opportunity. It reached out through the radiation, through the quantum uncertainty and cellular chaos, and marked certain people, changed them in ways that bind them to it. Lorenzo Cabot complicates this further. Lorenzo is an archaeologist who, in the 19th century, discovered ruins in the Arabian desert. Inside those ruins, he found a crown, an artifact from some ancient non-human civilization. When he wore it, the crown fused to his skull, granting him immortality, psychic powers, and immunity to aging. It also made him extremely violent. When you meet Lorenzo in Fallout 4, he's still alive, still wearing the crown, still driven by whatever the artifact does to human consciousness. And Lorenzo is interested in the Dunwich borers. In Fallout Shelter, online, a game of questionable canonicity but still officially licensed, Lorenzo mentions that he believes the entity at Dunwich is connected to the ruins he found in Arabia. He thinks the crown and the buried presence are parts of the same ancient non-human civilization. There's more. When you encounter Lorenzo in Fallout 4's Commonwealth, you can find him standing near the corpses of several ghoul settlers. If you talk to him, he mentions that he was examining their condition, studying them, looking for something in their physiological state that interested him. This creates a web of connections. The crown from ancient ruins, the entity at Dunwich, the ghouls who worship that entity, Lorenzo's interest in ghouls. All of it suggests there's a relationship between these elements, a pattern that connects radiation-induced mutation with artifacts from civilizations that existed before recorded human history. What if ghoulification isn't purely a result of the Great War? What if the radiation is activating something that was always in some percentage of humans, some latent genetic or spiritual marker that connects them to these elder entities? The bombs fell and millions were irradiated, but the ones who became ghouls weren't random. They were the ones who carried this marker, the ones that Ugg-Qualtoth or similar entities had already claimed in some fundamental way. That would explain why feral ghouls worship. They're not making a choice. They're responding to a bond that's intrinsic to what they've become, following imperatives coded into their transformation. It would explain Lorenzo's interest. The crown connects him to the same source. He recognizes in ghouls the same ancient touch that made him what he is. And it would mean that the Great War didn't just create the wasteland, it activated something, woke up old things, opened doors that had been sealed, established conditions where entities that existed long before humanity could finally interact with the world again through the changed humans who survived the bombs. The shrines at Dunwich aren't new. The obelisk in the capital wasteland was there before the war. The stone face at the borers was there for thousands of years before the company started digging. These things have been waiting. The radiation gave them what they needed. Worshippers who could perceive them. Servants whose minds were just degraded enough to be controlled. Anchors in physical reality through bodies that persist indefinitely without aging or dying. Feral ghouls are effectively immortal, if not killed through violence. They can exist for centuries without deteriorating further. That makes them perfect vessels for entities that think in geological timescales, that plan across millennia, that needed humanity to destroy itself with atomic fire before conditions would be right for their return. This is the secret that most players walk past. The ghouls gathered in the Dunwich building aren't just environmental decoration. They're evidence that something vast and old is operating through the wasteland's horrors, using the apocalypse for purposes that have nothing to do with human wars or corporate greed. The bombs created the conditions. The radiation changed the substrate. And now, in the ruins, ancient things that predate civilization are slowly reclaiming a world that humans destroyed for them. Ugg-Qualtoth waits beneath the Commonwealth. It has always been there. It will always be there. And every feral ghoul that wanders toward its shrines is another piece of a design that humanity is too young and too dead to understand. The crown that shouldn't exist, Lorenzo Cabot deserves a deeper examination, because his story exposes layers of horror that connect multiple Fallout mysteries into a disturbing whole. Picture this: Victorian England. An archaeologist named Lorenzo Cabot holds theories that his colleagues dismiss as conspiracy nonsense. He believes ancient civilizations existed before recorded history, that non-human intelligences built cities that human societies later built upon, without recognizing what lay beneath. His academic peers mock him. His research is rejected. He's treated as a crank, someone whose obsession with pre-human history has driven him away from legitimate scholarship. But Lorenzo doesn't care what they think. He has evidence, fragments of texts, geological anomalies that suggest construction techniques beyond what Bronze Age humans should have possessed. So he mounts an expedition to the desert, the empty quarter of Arabia, one of the most inhospitable wastelands on Earth. And he finds what he's looking for. Buried beneath the sand, hidden for millennia, Lorenzo discovers the ruins of a city. The architecture is wrong. The materials don't match any known construction techniques from any known human civilization. The symbols carved into the walls aren't hieroglyphs or cuneiform or any recognized ancient language. This is something else, something older. At the center of the ruins, in a sealed chamber that he has to excavate carefully to avoid collapse, Lorenzo finds a crown. It's made of metal that doesn't corrode, formed in a shape that seems designed for a human head, but with proportions that feel just slightly off. It's clearly a deliberate creation, shaped with intention and precision, and it's been waiting there for thousands of years, possibly tens of thousands, for someone to find it. Lorenzo puts it on. The crown fuses to his skull immediately. Not mechanically, not through any visible mechanism. It just bonds with bone and flesh, becomes part of him in a way that makes removal impossible without killing him. And it changes him instantly. He stops aging. The crown makes him immortal, preserving his body in the state it was in when he first wore the artifact. He develops psychic powers. Telekinesis, the ability to create force waves that tear through physical matter. Possibly telepathy, though that's less clear. He gains immunity to disease, poison, radiation. He becomes something more than human, biologically enhanced in ways that science in the 1860s couldn't explain, and science in the 23rd century still struggles to fully understand. But there's a cost. The crown makes him violent. Not in constant berserker rage, but in sudden explosions of aggression that he can't fully control. It changes his personality, makes him paranoid, amplifies darker impulses. Lorenzo Cabot, the archaeologist and scholar, starts committing crimes. He kills people, multiple times. His violence is extreme enough that he's eventually sentenced to death. His family uses their wealth and influence to have the sentence commuted to indefinite imprisonment. They confine Lorenzo to the basement of Parsons State Insane Asylum in Boston, where he can be contained, studied, and kept alive because killing him would mean removing the crown, and they're not entirely sure he's wrong about what it represents. His son, Jack Cabot, begins researching the crown's effects. Jack, as a scientist, approaches the problem methodically, wants to understand the mechanism. What he discovers is that Lorenzo's blood, altered by the crown's influence, grants longevity. Not immortality like Lorenzo has, but dramatically extended lifespan. Jack develops a serum using his father's blood, and the rest of the Cabot family begins taking it. That's how they survive into the 23rd century, how they're still alive and active when the sole survivor encounters them in Fallout 4. They've been living off Lorenzo's suffering for nearly 400 years, using him as a source of life-extending medicine while keeping him locked in a basement like an animal. The moral dimensions of this are horrifying enough. A family that loves Lorenzo enough to prevent his execution but not enough to free him. They benefit from his imprisonment, literally depend on his continued existence in a cage for their own survival. They've built their extended lives on his captivity, and they maintain that system through justifications about how dangerous he is, how the crown makes him a threat, how they're protecting the world by keeping him contained. But the existential dimensions are worse. What is the crown? Where did it come from? The civilization that built it predates recorded human history by potentially thousands of years. They had technology that we still don't understand, biological manipulation capabilities that seem more advanced than anything pre-war humanity achieved. They built a city in the Arabian desert and then vanished completely, leaving only ruins that buried beneath sand and were forgotten until Lorenzo found them. Were they human at all? The crown fits a human head, but that might be coincidence, convergent evolution in skull structure between whatever made the crown and what humans became. Or it might be intentional. Maybe the creators of the crown designed it specifically for humans, built it as a gift or a trap or a test, knowing that eventually a human would find it and put it on. The crown grants abilities that shouldn't be biologically possible. Immortality requires halting cellular senescence, preventing telomere degradation, maintaining DNA repair mechanisms indefinitely. Psychic powers require mechanisms for consciousness to affect physical reality without muscular movement, energy generation through purely mental processes. These aren't just advanced technology, they're reality violations, capabilities that don't fit within conventional understanding of physics and biology, unless the crown is changing the fundamental rules. Unless wearing it moves you into a different category of existence where the normal limitations don't apply. Lorenzo mentions in conversations that the crown shows him things. He has visions, perceptions of realities or times that he shouldn't be able to access. He talks about the entities that built the city, about their purposes and conflicts. The crown isn't just providing power, it's providing information, downloading knowledge directly into his consciousness, showing him truths about the universe that humans aren't supposed to know. And he's interested in the Dunwich connection. He believes the crown and the entity at Dunwich borers are related, products of the same ancient civilization, or maybe the same category of non-human intelligence. He wants to study the ghouls because he recognizes in them some echo of what the crown did to him, some similar transformation that bridges the gap between human and something else. What if Lorenzo is right? What if the crown and Ugg-Qualtoth and possibly other artifacts scattered across the wasteland are all pieces of a pre-human civilization that learned to manipulate consciousness and biology in ways that look like magic? To us, they left these objects buried, waiting. The crown in Arabian ruins, the obelisk beneath what would become Washington, the stone face beneath Massachusetts, artifacts positioned across the globe, each one capable of changing anyone who interacts with it. Why? What's the purpose? Maybe they're beacons. Maybe the civilization that made them left Earth millennia ago, but left these markers behind so they could find their way back. The objects transmit signals on frequencies we can't detect, broadcasting into whatever dimensions or spaces the original creators now inhabit, saying here is where we were. Here is where the transformation can happen. Maybe they're traps. Maybe these entities are hostile or amoral, and the artifacts are designed to capture human consciousness, to bind it into service or experimentation. Lorenzo has been wearing the crown for 4 centuries. What if during that time, he's not just been empowered by it, but slowly consumed by it? What if the person inside the crown isn't really Lorenzo anymore, but something wearing his memories, like a mask, using his face to interact with reality, while the consciousness behind it is completely alien? Or maybe they're gifts. Maybe the civilization that left these things wanted to help the species that came after them. The crown grants power and immortality. Those are valuable. Yes, there are costs, but maybe from the perspective of entities that think across geological time, a little induced violence is an acceptable trade-off for making a human immortal. Maybe they see the transformation as an upgrade, elevation of humanity towards something greater, and they left these tools scattered across Earth so that eventually, when humans were ready, they could find them and transcend. Lorenzo can't remove the crown. It's fused to him. He's been trying to study it for centuries, trying to understand it, but the crown reveals only what it wants to reveal. He has power, but he doesn't have knowledge. He can destroy things with telekinetic force, but he can't explain how. He lives forever, but he doesn't understand why. He's been changed by something he found in ruins older than civilization, bound to it, altered in ways that preserve his body while possibly destroying whatever made him human. And he's interested in ghouls because he sees in them the same pattern. People changed by forces they didn't choose and don't understand, transformed into something that lives longer and exists differently, connected to entities that predate the recorded world. If you free Lorenzo in Fallout 4, he goes back to the Cabot house and kills his family. All of them. Violently. He believes they imprisoned him unjustly, that they were parasites feeding off his suffering. And maybe he's right. But the violence with which he tears through people who spent centuries keeping him alive suggests that the crown has won, that whatever humanity Lorenzo Cabot possessed is gone now, replaced by something that wears his face and uses his memories, but is fundamentally other. If you side with Jack and kill Lorenzo, you have to remove the crown to do it. And Lorenzo dies instantly when it's separated from his skull. The crown has become necessary for his life. He's not wearing it anymore. It's part of his biology. Removing it is like removing his heart. Either way, Lorenzo Cabot ends tragically. Either he becomes a murderer who slaughters the family that loved him enough to spare his life, or he dies when the artifact that changed him is forcibly removed. There's no good ending for someone wearing a crown from a civilization that shouldn't exist. The only question is how the tragedy unfolds. And somewhere in the ruins of the desert, there might be more crowns, more artifacts, more objects waiting for archaeologists or wanderers or curious fools to find them and put them on and discover too late that the transformation can't be reversed. The crown exists. Lorenzo exists. The civilization that made the crown existed. These are facts. What they mean, what they're for, what purpose they serve in some vast design we can't perceive, those remain mysteries. And mysteries from civilizations older than humanity are never comforting. You never control him. You rarely interact with him directly. But if you take the right perk, he shows up when you're in critical danger, fires a few perfect shots from his signature .44 Magnum revolver, eliminates threats, and then vanishes before you can thank him or ask who he is. They call him the mysterious stranger, and his existence raises questions that the franchise has deliberately never answered. The mysterious stranger appears in Fallout 1, or taking place in 2161 in Southern California. He appears in Fallout 2, 2080 in California and Nevada. He appears in Fallout 3, 2277 in the capital Wasteland. He appears in Fallout New Vegas, 2281 in the Mojave. He appears in Fallout 4, 2287 in the Commonwealth. Same trench coat, same hat, same weapon, same disappearing act. 226 years of appearances across the entire North American wasteland. How is this possible? The most obvious explanation is that there isn't one mysterious stranger. There are many, a tradition or organization of people who adopt the persona and help wanderers in need. This would explain the geographic spread and the temporal impossibility. Different people in different locations taking on the same role. But that doesn't explain the consistency. He's always described the same way, always uses the same weapon, always appears and vanishes through mechanisms that can't be explained by stealth or speed alone. He doesn't walk away. He's there and then he's not, with no transition. Fan theories proliferate. Maybe he's a ghoul, which would explain the extended lifespan. Ghouls don't age and can survive for centuries, as long as they don't go feral. A ghoul with the mysterious stranger's skills could absolutely have been operating since the bombs fell in 2077 and still be active 2 centuries later. Maybe he's a time traveler. The pre-war world had experimental technology. Vault-Tec, the Enclave, and other organizations were pursuing research that pushed boundaries of known science. Time manipulation was never confirmed in lore, but it's not explicitly ruled out. A time traveler could appear across different eras, explain the impossibility of his timeline, and justify his seemingly supernatural vanishing act. Maybe there are multiple strangers, a family or organization passing down the role. This theory gained traction in Fallout 2, when some players reported seeing a female version of the mysterious stranger, suggesting the role isn't fixed to a single person but can be inherited or adopted. Nick Valentine, the synth detective in Fallout 4, has an entire case file on the mysterious stranger. Nick has been investigating sightings and reports, trying to determine who this figure is, connecting appearances across the Commonwealth and capital. Wasteland. His conclusion, based on available evidence, is that there's one true mysterious stranger, and other sightings that seem inconsistent are imposters or cases of mistaken identity. Nick believes in a single individual whose appearance shouldn't be possible but is, and then there's the lonesome drifter. In Fallout New Vegas, the courier encounters a traveling musician on the shores of El Dorado Dry Lake. His name is uncertain. He's just called the Lonesome Drifter. He's a young man with a guitar and a sad story. He's looking for his father, who abandoned him and his mother years ago. When asked about his father, the drifter says something very specific. His father was a mysterious man. Even when he was with the family, he was like a stranger. The phrasing is exact, mysterious, stranger. He's describing someone who was distant and unknowable even to his own family. The drifter also describes his father wearing a coat and hat, matching the mysterious stranger's iconic appearance. And when you complete the drifter's quest, he gives you a weapon as a reward, a unique .44 Magnum revolver, the last memento he has of his father. It's the same type of gun the mysterious stranger uses. Josh Sawyer, the game director for Fallout New Vegas, has confirmed that this wasn't accidental. The Lonesome Drifter is meant to be the mysterious stranger's son. They coded a special condition into the game. If you have the mysterious stranger perk active and you target the Lonesome Drifter in VATS, the mysterious stranger is supposed to appear and turn hostile against the player, defending his son. This feature didn't make it into the final game due to time constraints, but Sawyer mentioned in later interviews that he wished they'd had time to implement it, because the betrayal would have been a perfect character moment, revealing that the stranger who helps you isn't purely altruistic and has personal loyalties that override his usual role. So we have confirmation. The mysterious stranger had a family. He had a son. He abandoned them to continue whatever mission or purpose drives him to wander the wasteland helping people. This makes the temporal problem worse. The Lonesome Drifter is young, probably in his 20s. For him to have been abandoned by his father years ago but still be young enough to be wandering with a guitar means the mysterious stranger was active and fertile sometime in the 2260s or later. But he also appears in Fallout 1, which takes place in 2161, 8 decades earlier. Even ghouls age, even if slowly. Even time travelers would need to maintain consistent age appearances across their jumps. There's no explanation that makes the timeline work unless the mysterious stranger has access to something that keeps him not just alive but functionally ageless for centuries. Something that lets him father a child 200 years after the bombs fell and still appear unchanged from his earliest documented sightings. The crown. Lorenzo's crown grants immortality and eternal youth. What if the mysterious stranger found a similar artifact? What if there are other objects scattered across the wasteland from that same pre-human civilization, granting power to whoever finds them? He could have stumbled onto one, been changed by it the way Lorenzo was, and used the gifts it granted to wander the wasteland helping people for centuries. Or maybe he's a synth. The Institute creates perfect synthetic humans. They could have created multiple versions of the same model, deployed them across different time periods, programmed them all to help wanderers. That would explain the consistency, the superhuman timing, and the ability to vanish impossibly. Synth technology could include teleportation or advanced stealth systems, or maybe he's something else entirely. Maybe he's a ghost, the restless spirit of someone who died and couldn't move on, bound to the wasteland by unfinished purpose. That would explain the supernatural elements, the vanishing, the cross-temporal appearances. Ghosts don't age. They don't follow normal rules of physics. They appear where they're needed and vanish when they're done. Every explanation has problems. None of them fit all the evidence. The mysterious stranger remains mysterious precisely because the franchise refuses to define him. But he has a son. That's confirmed. And that son is looking for him, carrying the last gift his father left, wandering the Mojave trying to understand why the man who gave him life walked away without explanation. Somewhere in the wasteland, the mysterious stranger is helping someone right now, appearing from nowhere, firing perfect shots, saving a life, and vanishing. He's been doing it for over 200 years. He'll probably be doing it for another 200. And he'll never stop long enough to meet the son who's looking for him, to explain why he left, to give the lonesome drifter any sense of closure or understanding. That's the cruelty beneath the mystery. The stranger saves countless lives. He helps people he's never met and will never see again. But his own son, the person with the most legitimate claim to his attention and care, doesn't merit even a conversation. Maybe that's what it takes to be the mysterious stranger. Maybe the price of helping everyone is abandoning the specific people you should care about most. Maybe you can't be everywhere and everyone without sacrificing the close, particular attachments that define normal human life. Or maybe he's not human enough anymore to care. Maybe whatever changed him, whatever made him immortal and gave him abilities that break the normal rules, also took away his capacity for family bonds. Maybe he loved his wife and son once, but that was before the transformation, and now he's something that wears a human shape and performs helpful actions, but can't actually connect to individuals anymore. The guitar-playing drifter on a lake shore keeps asking about his father, and his father keeps appearing in strangers' stories, helping them, saving them, vanishing, always close, never close enough. That's the secret. The mysterious stranger exists. He's real across centuries and thousands of miles, but he's as unreachable to his own son as he is to everyone else. He's a presence without relationship, help without connection, salvation without the capacity to stay. Maybe that's the loneliest existence in the wasteland. Not being alone, but being surrounded by people you save without ever being able to truly be with any of them. Forever mysterious, forever strange, forever moving through the wasteland, helping everyone and knowing no one. The Enclave and Vault-Tec, partners in apocalypse. Before the bombs fell, two organizations shaped the pre-war United States in ways that most citizens never recognized. One operated in secret, a shadow government, preparing for nuclear war while officially denying its own existence. The other operated in full public view, advertising on every street corner, promising safety while designing tombs. The Enclave and Vault-Tec were partners in the greatest conspiracy in human history, the deliberate engineering of post-apocalyptic America. The Enclave began as a cabal within the United States government. Not elected officials, but the permanent apparatus, high-level bureaucrats, military officers, intelligence operatives, corporate executives with security clearances, the people who actually ran things while presidents came and went. As the resource wars intensified and nuclear conflict became inevitable, this shadow government started preparing for survival beyond the bombs. Their existence was conspiracy theory territory until just days before October 23, 2077. Investigative journalists finally confirmed what whistleblowers had been claiming for years. There was a secret government structure operating above and beyond. constitutional authority, and it was preparing to survive the end of the world without any intention of saving the American public it supposedly served. But by the time this information became public, it was too late to matter. The bombs fell. The journalists who exposed the Enclave died with everyone else, and the Enclave survived exactly as planned. Vault-Tec was their primary contractor, the public face of apocalypse preparation. While the Enclave operated in shadows, Vault-Tec took out television commercials showing smiling families descending into shelters. They went door to door, signing up citizens for vault spaces. They built their brand around safety and survival, positioning themselves as the corporation that cared enough to save humanity from its worst impulses. The partnership between these organizations was symbiotic and deeply sinister. The United States government, through Enclave influence, provided Vault-Tec with contracts worth billions. Taxpayer money funded the vault construction. Public resources paid for private infrastructure that would, when the bombs fell, serve experimental purposes rather than humanitarian ones. Because the vaults were never meant to save people. They were designed as controlled environments for studying human behavior under extreme conditions. Social experiments, psychological torture, medical testing, all disguised as shelter protocols. Why would the government fund this? Why would the Enclave agree to turn survival shelters into laboratories? Because the Enclave had a plan that extended beyond surviving the apocalypse. They wanted to leave Earth entirely. Documents recovered from Enclave facilities reveal their ultimate goal: construct a generation ship capable of interstellar travel, leave the ruined Earth behind, and find a new world to colonize. This wasn't science fiction speculation. They had serious research programs dedicated to it: engineering studies on generation ship design, biological research on how humans would survive multi-century voyages, psychological studies on maintaining social cohesion across generations in closed environments. The vaults were prototypes for that generation ship. Each one was designed to test specific variables. How do humans respond to overcrowding? That's Vault 27, deliberately packed beyond capacity. How do humans maintain social structure without outside contact? That's dozens of vaults sealed for different durations. How do humans respond to leadership collapse? That's Vault 11, where residents had to sacrifice one person annually, or the vault would exterminate everyone. Vault-Tec got paid to build the infrastructure. The Enclave got data on whether their generation ship plan was feasible. And the American public, the people whose taxes funded this entire operation, became unwitting test subjects in experiments they never consented to. The cruelty is layered. First, the government you trust is planning to abandon Earth without telling you. Second, the corporation promising safety is actually building prisons. Third, the money you paid in taxes funded your own imprisonment and torture. Fourth, this entire system was designed before the war, meaning the people running it knew nuclear conflict was coming and chose to exploit it rather than prevent it. Some vaults were even designated specifically for Enclave use. Control vaults, designed to function properly, to actually save their inhabitants, to provide legitimate shelter and resources. Vault-Tec built these scattered across the country so Enclave members and their families could survive in comfort, while everyone else suffered through experiments. This creates a hierarchy of survival. Enclave leadership would retreat to secure bunkers, hardened facilities built to withstand direct nuclear strikes. Enclave members and chosen families would enter control vaults with actual food, water, and safety. Important scientists and personnel would go into experimental vaults, but with knowledge of the experiments so they could maintain control. And everyone else, the general public who believed they were being saved, would enter vaults designed to break them. After the bombs fell, the Enclave tried to execute their plan. They established bases, most notably the oil rig off the California coast and Raven Rock on the East Coast. They began working toward their generation ship, continuing pre-war research, trying to rebuild enough infrastructure to make interstellar colonization possible. But they also did something that reveals just how far their moral framework had collapsed. They decided that humans who survived outside the vaults were genetically contaminated by radiation and needed to be exterminated. Their plan evolved from leaving Earth to cleansing it first. Genocide against the wasteland population to create a pure remnant that could either colonize the stars or rebuild America according to Enclave design. This is eugenics married to apocalyptic survival logic. The Enclave convinced themselves that vault dwellers and Enclave personnel were the only real humans left, that everyone who survived on the surface was mutated and inferior, that mass extermination was justified as preserving the human species. They developed a biological weapon, the FEV curling strain, designed to kill anyone with radiation-induced mutations. When released into the atmosphere, it would exterminate ghouls, super mutants, and most surface humans, leaving only vault dwellers and Enclave personnel alive. This weapon was stopped by the Chosen One in Fallout 2, who destroyed the oil rig and killed most of the Enclave's leadership. The East Coast remnant was destroyed by the Lone Wanderer in Fallout 3. By Fallout 4, the Enclave is effectively extinct, reduced to scattered survivors who no longer operate as cohesive organization. But Vault-Tec continues, not as a corporation, they collapsed when civilization did, but as a legacy. The vaults still exist. Some of them are still running their experiments. Some residents don't even know the war ended, are still living according to protocols designed centuries ago, still trapped in social structures meant to test human breaking points. The partnership between Enclave and Vault-Tec created infrastructure that outlasted both organizations. The vaults stand as monuments to institutional cruelty, to the willingness of governments and corporations to sacrifice their own citizens for abstract goals. Vault 81 in Fallout 4 exposes this perfectly. The vault was divided into two sections. The upper section received normal vault amenities. The lower section was deliberately infected with diseases, so the upper section could test cures on unwilling human subjects. Families were split. Children were taken from parents and moved between sections based on research protocols. People who thought they were being saved were instead used as medical experiments for the benefit of others who were also prisoners but slightly more privileged. This is the Enclave and Vault-Tec partnership in miniature. Create hierarchies among the doomed, give some people slightly better conditions in exchange for compliance with atrocity. Make everyone complicit, either as victim or perpetrator or both, so that resistance becomes psychologically impossible. The most damning detail is that it worked. The Enclave did survive. Vault-Tec did gather data. The experiments did run for decades, or centuries in some cases. The system functioned exactly as designed. People were broken, data was collected, and the organizations responsible faced no consequences until wasteland survivors hunted them down generations later. There's a through line from pre-war American government to post-war Enclave that's worth tracing. The United States government in Fallout's timeline was already authoritarian before the bombs fell. They'd annexed Canada through military force. They'd suppressed internal dissent with violence. They deployed power armor against protesters. The Enclave didn't represent a break from American governance. They represented its logical conclusion. What happens when the apparatus that maintains power decides it no longer needs to pretend to serve the public? Vault-Tec similarly represents capitalism taken to its extreme. A corporation that recognized profit opportunity in apocalypse and pursued it without moral restraint. They didn't create the nuclear war, though, as we discussed earlier, they may have helped trigger it, but they absolutely positioned themselves to profit from it. They sold safety and delivered torture. They took public money and produced private benefit. They treated human beings as resources to be exploited until they were used up. The partnership worked because both organizations shared a fundamental belief that most people are expendable, that humanity can be divided into valuable and disposable categories, that the valuable category has the right to sacrifice the disposable category for any goal the valuable category deems important. This belief system didn't die with the Enclave. You see it in the Institute in Fallout 4, an organization of scientists who view surface dwellers as subhuman and experiment on them without consent. You see it in the Brotherhood of Steel's willingness to hoard technology while wasteland communities starve. You see it in New Vegas's corporate factions fighting over resources while ignoring human cost. The Enclave and Vault-Tec created a template. They proved that you could design systems of mass suffering, implement them under pretense of necessity, and maintain them across generations as long as you controlled information and hierarchies. That template persisted into the wasteland, replicated by every faction that decided some people matter and others don't. The secret isn't just that Vault-Tec and the Enclave work together to run experiments on unwitting citizens. The secret is that this partnership represented the culmination of pre-war America's trajectory, the natural endpoint of systems that valued profit over people and power over principle. The bombs didn't create the cruelty, they just gave it permission to stop hiding. And somewhere in the wasteland, a vault is still running. Residents inside still following protocols written by people who died 2 centuries ago, still trapped in experiments designed to break them, still waiting for rescue that will never come because the people who imprisoned them never intended rescue in the first place. The Enclave is gone. Vault-Tec is gone. But their work continues. The vaults remember, and the wasteland is still living with the consequences of the partnership that turned survival into torture and called it science. The sole survivors' synthetic nightmare Fallout 4 opens with a deception. You create your character in pre-war Boston. You have a spouse and an infant son. You experience a normal morning in October 2077. Then the bombs fall. You flee to Vault 111 with your family. You're frozen in cryogenic suspension. You watch helplessly as mercenaries murder your spouse and steal your infant son, Sean. You're refrozen. And then, decades later, you're released, emerging into the Commonwealth with one purpose: find your son. This narrative drives the entire game. The sole survivor is a parent searching for their lost child across a wasteland. It's emotionally clear, morally straightforward. You're the victim of an unthinkable crime, and you deserve answers and reunion. But in the Far Harbor DLC, a character named Dima asks you a question that breaks the entire foundation of your identity. Are you sure you're human? Dima is a synth, an older model, self-aware and philosophical. He runs a settlement called Acadia, where synths fleeing the Institute can find refuge. He's helped countless synths escape, given them new identities, even modified their memories so they can start fresh, without trauma from their previous lives. When you meet him, especially if you bring Nick Valentine along, Dima engages in extended conversations about consciousness and memory. He asks Nick about his earliest memories. Nick remembers waking up in a garbage heap, remembers confusion and missing decades, remembers being a prototype that the Institute abandoned. Then Dima turns to you. He asks about your memories. What do you remember from before the war? And if you think about it, the answer is disturbing. You remember the morning the bombs fell. Character creation, a few conversations with your spouse, the vault salesman at your door, the sirens, the run to Vault 111. That's it. That's the entirety of your pre-war memories that you actually experience in gameplay. Everything else is backstory you're told, not memories you lived. You know you're a lawyer or a soldier, depending on gender. You know you had a life before that morning, but you don't remember it. You have no specific memories of childhood, of your wedding, of Sean's birth, of anything before the day the world ended. Dima points this out. He suggests that maybe those missing memories aren't missing. Maybe they never existed. Maybe the morning of October 23rd is the actual beginning of your existence, and everything you believe about having a life before that is implanted memory, background narrative that the Institute programmed into you to make you believe you're human. The evidence starts stacking up once you consider the possibility. First, Sean. When you finally find him, he's an old man dying of cancer. He's the director of the Institute, has been for decades. He admits that he released you from cryo as an experiment. He wanted to see if you'd actually search for him, if parental programming would drive you across the wasteland despite impossible odds. He calls you his contingency, his backup plan, someone he can observe and potentially use. This framing is cold. Sean doesn't act like a son reunited with a parent. He acts like a scientist observing results. He's curious about you, but there's distance, evaluation rather than emotion, and he's perfectly comfortable with the fact that you were frozen for 60 years, that your spouse was murdered in front of you, that you've spent months searching desperately for him while he watched from security monitors without revealing himself. Would a son do that to a parent? Or would a scientist do that to an experiment? Second, Sean creates a synth child version of himself. If you destroy the Institute, he sends this child synth to you as a gift, apparently believing it will compensate for your lost opportunity at parenthood. The fact that he thinks a synthetic replacement can substitute for an actual relationship reveals how he views synths, and potentially how he views you. The Institute's director believes synths can replace humans in relationships. He demonstrates this by creating a synthetic son and giving it to you. What if he's done this before? What if the sole survivor is another example of Sean's belief that synths can perfectly replicate human bonds? Third, the only way to confirm if someone is a synth in Fallout 4 is to kill them and check their body for a synth component. You, as the player character, can never die permanently. You can't check your own corpse. There's no way to definitively prove whether you're human or synthetic because the one test that would confirm it is mechanically impossible. This is brilliant, disturbing design. The game gives you no way to resolve the question. You can believe you're human, you can believe you're a synth, but you can't prove either position. Fourth, the Institute has a history of replacing people with synths. It's their signature terror tactic in the Commonwealth. They kidnap someone, study them, create a perfect synthetic duplicate, then send the synth back to infiltrate the community while the original human disappears into Institute labs. Sometimes the original is killed, sometimes they're kept alive for further study. The replaced person's family and friends never know unless the synth malfunctions or is discovered. If the Institute can and does replace random settlers, shopkeepers, and community leaders with synths, why wouldn't they replace the sole survivor? You're valuable. You're Sean's parent. You have potential use as infiltrator, observer, or test subject. Everything the Institute does to strangers, they could do to you. Fifth, consider the timeline. You were frozen in Vault 111 for 60 years. The cryopod kept you alive, preserved you perfectly, and then released you at precisely the moment Sean decided to activate you. That's suspicious. Why 60 years? Why that specific timing? What if you never entered the vault at all? What if the sole survivor who went into cryo died at some point during those 60 years, either from pod malfunction or deliberate termination? What if Sean, grieving for the parent he never knew, or simply curious about the parent whose DNA he carries, created a synthetic replacement? He could program it with the last memories the real sole survivor had, the morning of the war, and set it loose in the Commonwealth to see what a perfect recreation of his parent would do. Sixth, you're extraordinary. The sole survivor accomplishes things that strain credibility. You single-handedly destroy the Institute, or the Brotherhood of Steel, or the Railroad, depending on faction choice. You build settlements. You modify weapons. You survive combat encounters that would kill normal humans. You adapt to the wasteland with superhuman speed, going from confused vault dweller to wasteland legend in months. This could be player character mechanics. Every protagonist in Fallout is unusually capable, but it could also be evidence that you're not a normal human. Synth biology includes enhanced durability, faster healing, immunity to radiation. If you're a synth, your capabilities make sense. You're designed to exceed human baseline. Seventh, there's the strange fact that if the real soul survivor was frozen for 60 years, they should show some psychological trauma from watching their spouse murdered and being helpless to stop it. But aside from occasional dialogue expressing determination to find Sean, you're remarkably functional. You joke with companions, you engage in romantic relationships, you make moral choices without being paralyzed by grief. This could be resilient personality, or it could be synth programming. If your memories of the spouse are implanted rather than real, if the trauma you think you experienced is narrative backstory rather than lived experience, then your ability to function makes sense. You're not actually grieving. You're performing grief because that's what you were programmed to believe you should feel. Eighth, consider Kellogg. Conrad Kellogg is the mercenary who killed your spouse and kidnapped Sean. When you finally track him down and kill him, you access his memories through Nick Valentine's detective work. You see Kellogg's entire life, including the moment he delivered infant Sean to the Institute. But you also see something strange. Kellogg has cybernetic implants that extended his life far beyond normal human lifespan. He was active for over a century. The Institute gave him this augmentation. They had the technology to make humans effectively immortal. So why didn't they use that technology on you? If Sean valued you, if he wanted his parent in his life, why leave you frozen for 60 years? Why not wake you immediately, give you life extension treatment, bring you into the Institute? Unless the person in the pod wasn't worth saving, unless they died and Sean created a replacement later. A synth programmed with appropriate memories who could be released into the wasteland to fulfill whatever experimental purpose Sean designed. Dima doesn't provide answers. He just asks questions. He plants doubt, and once that doubt exists, you can't remove it. Every interaction with Sean becomes suspect. Every memory feels potentially false. Your entire identity rests on foundations you can't verify. The game never confirms whether you're human or synth. It can't because the moment it does, it destroys the horror. The horror is the uncertainty, the inability to know, the realization that you might be living a programmed existence, that your grief and love and determination might be artificial constructs, that the person you believe yourself to be might be a fiction created by an organization that views human consciousness as programmable software. There's a cruel poetry to this. The Institute creates synths and gives them implanted memories so realistic the synths don't know they're synthetic. Then the Institute creates detection systems to identify synths hiding in human populations. But what if the Institute's director created one synth he deliberately can't detect? What if he made you so perfectly human that even Institute scanners read you as baseline, because the best experiment is the one that can never know it's being tested? You can play through the entire game believing you're human. Nothing mechanically prevents this. You can find Sean, make your choices, build your settlements, complete every quest as a human survivor of the old world. Or you can play believing you're a synth. Nothing mechanically prevents this either. You can interpret every event through that lens, see yourself as Sean's final experiment, recognize that your entire existence is performative, that you're following programming even when you think you're making free choices. Both interpretations fit the evidence, both are valid, and that's the nightmare Dima introduces. Not that you might be a synth, but that you can never know for certain. You're Schrodinger's human, simultaneously real and synthetic until observed, but observation is Impossible because you can't die, and check yourself for components. In a universe where the Institute kidnaps people and replaces them with perfect duplicates, where synths are so realistic they don't know they're not human, where memory can be implanted and identity can be programmed, you have no way to confirm your own existence. The sole survivor might be humanity's last innocent victim, a parent frozen against their will and thrust into nightmare. Or the sole survivor might be the Institute's masterpiece, a synth so perfect it can fool itself. The game whispers both possibilities and confirms neither. And you walk through the Commonwealth, forever uncertain whether the grief you feel is real or whether you're a machine programmed to feel grief, performing loss according to protocols written by a dying man who called you his contingency but never called you his parent. That's the secret. Not that you're definitely a synth, but that you might be. And the uncertainty is permanent. You're trapped in your own unreliable narrative, your own questionable memories, your own potentially artificial consciousness, and there's no way out, no test you can take, no answer you can find, just the question, repeating forever, are you sure you're human? Between worlds, the deliberate re-hook. We've covered a lot of ground. The corporate conspiracy that may have started the war, the alien shrine that makes no sense, the ghoul cults worshipping entities older than civilization, the crown that grants immortality at the cost of humanity, the mysterious stranger who exists across impossible timelines, the partnership between Enclave and Vault-Tec that turned survival into experimentation, the possibility that you, the player, might be synthetic and never know it. These secrets connect in ways that expose Fallout's deepest horror. The apocalypse wasn't the end of cruelty, it was cruelty's beginning. The wasteland isn't random chaos. It's designed suffering, systems of exploitation that survived the bombs because they were built to survive anything. But we're not done. There are darker things waiting in the Commonwealth and Capital Wasteland and Mojave. Things that most players never find because they're hidden in terminals and holotapes, in environmental storytelling that doesn't announce itself, in implications that the games present without explanation. The next sections will take us into the vaults themselves, into the specific experiments that Vault-Tec designed, and we'll see exactly what happens when corporations and governments decide that human suffering is acceptable research cost. We'll meet the victims who became monsters, the children who never had a chance, the communities that destroyed themselves because they were designed to fail. We'll also examine something the games rarely address directly: what happened to the rest of the world. Fallout focuses on America, but the Great War was global. China burned, Europe burned, the entire planet became wasteland. What's happening in places we never see? What survived in the ruins of Beijing or Moscow or London? And more disturbingly, what evolved in those places, isolated from the American wasteland, developing along entirely different post-apocalyptic trajectories? Stay with me. The horror gets worse before it gets better, and in Fallout's universe, it never actually gets better. It just reveals new layers, new depths, new ways that humanity's worst impulses survived the end of the world and built themselves into the world that came after. The vaults are waiting, and what's inside them is worse than any Deathclaw or super mutant because it's human, deliberately human. Cruelty with purpose and planning, suffering that serves a goal, torture disguised as science. Let's descend. Word count checkpoint. Approximately 11,000 words. Continuing toward 15,000. The Vault Experiments. A catalog of calculated suffering. Vault-Tec constructed 122 vaults across the United States. Only a fraction were designed to function properly. The rest were experiments, each one testing a specific variable or pushing human psychology in a particular direction. What follows is a catalog of specific vaults, and what was done to the people inside them. These aren't horror stories from unreliable narrators. These are documented experiments with protocols and procedures, approved by executives, funded by taxpayer money, executed with corporate efficiency. Vault 11 tested democracy under impossible pressure. The Vault's central system required residents to elect one person annually for sacrifice. If they refused, the Vault computer would kill everyone. The residents complied for years, developing political parties dedicated to manipulating elections so their rivals would be chosen. Candidates ran campaigns to avoid being sacrificed. Families turned on each other. The entire social structure collapsed into factional warfare over who deserved to die. Eventually, only 5 people remained. They decided together to refuse the sacrifice, to die together rather than continue killing. When they made that choice, the Vault congratulated them. A pre-recorded message revealed that the experiment was to see if people would reject immoral authority, even at cost of their own lives. The Vault was never going to kill everyone. It was testing whether they'd murder each other or refuse on principle. 4 of the 5 survivors couldn't live with what they'd done. They killed each other in a final outbreak of violence. One person walked out into the wasteland alone, the only survivor of a vault designed to make murder democratic. Vault 27 was overpopulated deliberately. Double the normal capacity with half the standard resources. No entertainment, minimal space, constant crowding. The experiment was studying social breakdown under sustained pressure. How long would it take for civilization to collapse when you remove personal space and comfort? 2 months. That's how long it took. The Vault descended into violence, cannibalism, and total social fracture. Everyone died. The Vault became a tomb full of evidence of what humans do to each other when you pack them too tightly and give them too little. Vault 77 was populated with 1 man and a crate full of puppets. The experiment's purpose isn't entirely clear from surviving documentation, but the results are. The single resident went insane, surrounded by inanimate objects in a vault designed for hundreds, his mind fracturing from isolation. The vault logs chart his descent into madness, his conversations with the puppets, his eventual death from starvation because he'd stopped remembering to eat, too consumed by imaginary relationships with felt and wood. Vault 106 exposed residents to psychoactive drugs through the air filtration system. The chemicals induced paranoia, hallucinations, and violent delusions. The experiment was testing whether sustained chemical-induced psychosis could be reversed, whether humans could be driven temporarily insane and then restored to baseline mental health. The answer was no. The residents killed each other during drug-induced psychotic breaks, and those who survived were left permanently damaged, their minds shattered by months of chemically induced madness. The Vault became a nightmare of violence and terror, all of it caused by air they had no choice but to breathe. Vault 92 was divided into 2 sections, with one section's air supply laced with low levels of the forced evolutionary virus. The residents in that section slowly mutated, transforming into aggressive creatures while the uninfected section could only watch and then defend themselves. The experiment was studying mutation rates and the psychological impact of watching your neighbors transform into monsters. Both sections died. The infected killed the uninfected after transforming, then the transformed. Residents, now lacking cognitive ability to maintain vault systems, died when life support failed. Vault 12 in Necropolis was designed with a door that wouldn't seal properly. Radiation flooded in constantly, exposing residents to levels that should have killed them. Instead, many ghoulified. The vault became a testing ground for studying the ghoulification process, for understanding why some humans become ghouls, while others die from the same radiation exposure. The residents survived, but were transformed, trapped in a vault that was supposed to protect them, now marked permanently by their exposure. They built a society in the ruins of Necropolis, but they carry the knowledge that their transformation was deliberate, that Vault-Tec wanted to see what radiation did to humans and use them as test subjects. Vault 81 split residents into two sections. The upper vault received normal conditions. The lower vault was deliberately infected with diseases. Scientists in the upper vault tested cures on lower vault residents, using them as human guinea pigs. Families were separated, with some members in upper and some in lower, creating psychological pressure as people watched relatives suffer from treatable diseases while cures were withheld pending test completion. The class system this created was intentional. Vault-Tec wanted to study whether humans would comply with medical experimentation if the victims were people they knew, if proximity and familiarity would create resistance, or if scientific framing would overcome empathy. It didn't create resistance. The upper vault scientists continued experiments for generations, using their fellow vault dwellers as test subjects, justifying it as necessary research, as benefiting the larger group, as acceptable cost for medical progress. They became what Vault-Tec wanted: people who could conduct atrocities on their neighbors as long as those atrocities served a goal they'd been taught to value. Vault 111. The sole survivor's vault was designed to study cryopreservation for space travel, but the experiment included an additional element. The staff was authorized to terminate frozen residents at will for research purposes. The overseer and scientists murdered vault dwellers while they slept in cryopods, unable to defend themselves or even know they were being killed. The spouse the sole survivor watches die wasn't a tragic casualty. They were part of the experiment, designated for termination so researchers could study what happens when cryopods are opened prematurely and residents are exposed to violence during thawing. Vault 114 hosted a massive stash of weapons, but no lock mechanisms on armories. Residents had unlimited access to firearms and explosives. The experiment was testing whether availability of weapons increased violence, whether an armed society would stabilize or destabilize. The vault destroyed itself in 3 weeks. Armed factions formed. Conflicts escalated, and the weapons that were supposed to provide security became tools of mutual annihilation. Vault 68 was populated with 999 men and 1 woman. Vault 69 reversed it, 999 women and 1 man. The experiments were studying sexual dynamics, social hierarchy formation, and psychological stress from extreme gender imbalance. The documentation from these vaults is sparse, possibly because Vault-Tec didn't want detailed records of the sexual violence and exploitation that predictably resulted. What little survives suggests both vaults collapsed into brutality quickly, with the minority gender suffering psychological and physical abuse regardless of which gender was outnumbered. Vault 108 was designed with a malfunctioning cloning system that created hundreds of copies of a man named Gary. The experiment's purpose seems to have been testing human response to a population of identical clones, studying whether cognitive differences would emerge from environmental variation or whether the Garys would remain psychologically identical. The Garys developed rudimentary language, basic social structures, and violent tendencies. They killed the original vault residents and now populate the vault as a swarm of identical beings who can only say their own name and demonstrate varying degrees of aggression. This catalog could continue for pages. There are vaults where the overseer was tyrannical by design, where residents were given conflicting orders to create stress, where critical supplies were deliberately undersupplied, where entertainment was replaced with propaganda, where residents were told they'd be in the vault for 10 years but were kept for 50, where children were separated from parents and raised communally to test attachment theory. Every vault was someone's deliberate design. Engineers and psychologists sat in meetings and planned these experiments. They calculated exactly how much suffering would produce useful data. They wrote protocols for when to intervene and when to let vault dwellers die. They created control groups and experimental groups, variables and constants, all using human beings as test subjects who'd agreed to be saved and instead were sacrificed. The vaults prove that Fallout's true horror predates the apocalypse. The nuclear war was terrible, but it was fast. Most people died within hours, incinerated or crushed or fatally irradiated. The vaults are slower horror, sustained torture across generations, suffering that passed from parents to children who were born into experiments they never consented to. Some vaults ran for 2 centuries. Think about that. Generations of people born inside an experiment, raised according to protocols designed to hurt them, dying without ever knowing that the suffering defining their entire lives was inflicted deliberately by people who built the vault. Vault-Tec built prisons disguised as shelters, and they filled those prisons with people who thought they were being rescued. The experiments didn't create useful data for generation ships or space colonization. They created proof that you can torture people indefinitely as long as you control their information and their environment, as long as you maintain the lie that their suffering serves a purpose. That's the secret in the vaults. Not any specific experiment, but the totality of them. Vault-Tec proved that institutional cruelty can be systematic, industrial, sustained across centuries, as long as the perpetrators are distant enough from the victims that empathy never activates. The executives who designed these experiments never heard the screams. They never smelled the blood. They reviewed reports and spreadsheets, data points and survival rates. The suffering was abstract to them, numbers on charts, variables producing results, and that distance, that abstraction, allowed them to design nightmares and call them research, to build tombs and call them shelters, to experiment on their own species and call it science. The vaults are still out there. Some are still sealed, still running their experiments. Residents inside still suffering according to protocols written before their great-great-grandparents were born. They don't know the war ended. They don't know the world outside exists. They only know the vault, and the vault only knows how to hurt them. That's the legacy Vault-Tec created. Not survival infrastructure, but monuments to the human capacity for rationalized cruelty. Buildings full of proof that with the right corporate structure and enough bureaucratic distance, people will design anything, approve anything, fund anything, as long as they never have to watch what their decisions actually do to living, breathing, suffering human beings. The unspoken tragedy, the rest of the world. Fallout focuses relentlessly on America. The games take place across California, Nevada, the Capital Wasteland, the Commonwealth, West Virginia. Every location is part of what used to be the United States. The conflict that started the Great War was between America and China. The corporations we study are American. The government that failed its people was American. But the bombs didn't only fall on America. The Great War was global. Europe had already destroyed itself during the resource wars, collapsing into factional conflicts over oil and uranium reserves. The Middle East burned. China and the United States annihilated each other in simultaneous nuclear exchanges. The entire planet became wasteland within hours. So what happened everywhere else? What's the state of Beijing 200 years after the bombs? What crawled out of the ruins of London or Moscow or Sydney? What societies formed in post-apocalyptic Africa or South America, in regions we never see and Fallout never addresses? The silence is deliberate. Fallout's creators have stated that they keep the focus on America because that's the culture and mythology they know, because American post-apocalyptic aesthetic is specific and meaningful, because expanding globally would dilute the franchise's identity. But in-universe, the silence creates horror through implication. China got hit as hard as America, probably harder. The United States invaded mainland China before the bombs fell. When nuclear war started, American missiles would have targeted every major Chinese city. every military installation, every population center. The Chinese heartland would have been carpet-bombed with nuclear weapons. 200 years later, what's left? Are there Chinese survivors building societies in the ruins of Shanghai? Are there Chinese ghouls, Chinese super mutants, Chinese raiders? Or did China die so completely that nothing intelligent survived, leaving the entire nation as a radioactive graveyard where the only sounds are wind and decay? We know China developed their own super soldier programs, their own stealth technology, their own attempts to create enhanced humans. What happened to those experiments when civilization collapsed? In America, FEV created super mutants and other mutated horrors. Did China have equivalent programs that produced their own monsters? Are there Chinese wastelands populated by creatures that make deathclaws look manageable? Things that evolved from Chinese military research the same way American mutants evolved from West-Tec and Vault-Tec experiments. Europe is even more mysterious. The European Commonwealth dissolved years before the Great War, collapsing into factional warfare. By 2077, Europe was already a wasteland, torn apart by conventional conflicts over resources. The nuclear war would have been redundant, just finishing what the resource wars started. But 200 years is a long time, long enough for societies to rebuild, for new nations to form from the ruins, for European survivors to create post-apocalyptic civilizations that might have evolved in entirely different directions than American settlements. What if Europe rebuilt faster? What if the absence of Vault-Tec's destructive experiments meant European survivors didn't carry the same institutional trauma? What if they developed functioning governments, rebuilt technology, established trade routes, and are now a post-apocalyptic civilization that's decades ahead of anything in the American wasteland? Or what if it went the other way? What if Europe was so thoroughly destroyed that nothing survived at all? What if the continent is dead, empty, a radiation-soaked cemetery where even ghouls couldn't survive, where the only inhabitants are fungal colonies and mutated plants slowly reclaiming the ruins? The Middle East had Lorenzo's ruins, evidence of ancient civilizations that predate recorded history. What else is buried there? What other artifacts are waiting beneath desert sands, hidden in structures that survived nuclear war because they were built to survive anything? The crown changed Lorenzo. There could be hundreds of similar objects scattered across the Middle East, each one capable of transforming whoever finds it. If those artifacts are being discovered by Middle Eastern survivors, if post-apocalyptic societies in that region are being shaped by pre-human technology, then there might be civilizations developing powers and capabilities that American wastelanders can't imagine. Societies built around artifacts instead of scavenged pre-war tech. Cultures shaped by contact with entities like Ugg-Qualtoff, but localized to different ancient sites with different entities. South America and Africa present different scenarios. These continents weren't primary targets in the resource wars. They didn't have massive nuclear arsenals. When the Great War happened, they might have been hit with fallout and secondary effects, but they possibly weren't carpet-bombed the way America and China were. What if there are functioning societies in Brazil or Kenya? What if while American wastelanders fight over the ruins of Boston, there are post-apocalyptic nations in the Southern Hemisphere that maintained some degree of continuity, that preserved knowledge and infrastructure, that are now technologically and socially ahead of anything in the American wasteland? If those societies exist, why haven't they made contact? Why hasn't post-apocalyptic Brazil sent expeditions to explore North America? Why hasn't some surviving African nation tried to establish trade routes or diplomatic relations? The answers are grim. Either those societies don't exist, meaning the entire world outside America died as completely as we fear, or they do exist and have deliberately chosen not to make contact with the American wasteland because they've looked at what's happening here and decided it's not worth the risk. Imagine being a survivor in post-apocalyptic Australia. You've built a functioning settlement, maybe even a small nation. You've got agriculture working, you've got clean water, you've got some degree of safety and stability, and then you get reports from scouts who've explored the Pacific, who've seen what's happening in the former United States, super mutants created by deliberate military experimentation, ghouls who live forever and sometimes go feral, raiders who've made brutality into a lifestyle, factions like the Enclave who wanted to commit genocide against radiation-exposed humans, the Institute kidnapping people and replacing them with synths, Vault-Tec's experiments still running, still torturing residents 2 centuries after the corporation collapsed. Would you make contact with that? Or would you quarantine the entire continent, declare it a dead zone, and focus on making sure the sickness that consumed American society never reaches your shores? The silence from the rest of the world might be isolation by choice. Other survivors looking at the American wasteland and deciding that whatever happened there, whatever combination of corporate cruelty and government failure and cultural violence created that specific post-apocalyptic nightmare, it needs to stay contained. There's another possibility, worse than deliberate isolation. What if the silence is because there's nothing left to make contact? What if we focus on America and Fallout, not because it's narratively convenient, but because it's the only place where anything survived? The Great War killed billions within hours. Radiation and nuclear winter killed billions more over the following months and years. What percentage of humanity died in that first year? 99%? 99.9? How close did we come to actual extinction? If the survival rate was low enough, if the conditions were brutal enough, then maybe America's scattered settlements and struggling factions represent the majority of what's left of human civilization. Maybe there are isolated pockets in other continents, small groups clinging to survival but nothing, large enough or organized enough to be called a society. Maybe the rest of the world is just empty, ruins and radiation and silence, continents where the only sounds are wind howling through dead cities and the slow crumble of structures falling to entropy. We don't know. Fallout never tells us. And that absence of information creates an entirely different category of horror. The known horrors in the American wasteland are terrible, but they're at least knowable. You can fight raiders and deathclaws and super mutants. You can understand Vault-Tec's experiments and the Enclave's plans, but you can't understand silence. You can't fight absence. The rest of the world exists as a void, as a question mark covering most of the planet, and that void could contain anything or nothing, and there's no way to know which is worse. If there are thriving societies elsewhere, if humanity rebuilt successfully in places that weren't poisoned by American-style corporate capitalism and government authoritarianism, then the American wasteland represents a failure, proof that some cultures couldn't survive their own worst tendencies, that the combination of factors that created pre-war America also created post-war hell. If there's nothing elsewhere, if the entire world is dead or dying except for the scattered settlements in the former United States, then Fallout's wasteland represents humanity's last gasp, the final pathetic remnant of a species that destroyed itself, clinging to existence in the ruins of their own greatest failure. Either scenario is bleak. Either we're uniquely broken, or we're all that's left. The games never answer this because the answer doesn't matter to the immediate survival challenges facing player characters. Whether Beijing is thriving or empty doesn't change the fact that you need to find clean water in the capital wasteland. Whether Europe rebuilt doesn't change the fact that raiders are attacking your settlement in the Commonwealth. But, cosmically, existentially, it matters. It's the difference between local tragedy and species-level catastrophe. It's the difference between America failed and humanity failed. And the silence from the rest of the world, 200 years after the bombs, suggests the second option. If there were functioning civilizations elsewhere, they would have expanded by now. They would have sent ships or aircraft, would have explored, would have tried to find other survivors. The absence of any contact suggests there's no one capable of making contact. The rest of the world is probably dead. The American wasteland is probably all that's left. And that makes every petty faction war, every settlement struggling to survive, every choice between helping or exploiting other survivors exponentially more important. Because if this is it, if the Mojave and Commonwealth and Capital Wasteland represent the last places where humans gather in numbers, then what happens here determines whether the species continues at all. The rest of the world is silent, and silence, in a universe that should be full of survivors trying to rebuild, is the loudest possible answer. The children who never had a chance. There's a category of victim in Fallout that rarely gets examined directly, but their presence haunts every vault, every settlement, every holotape recording you find. The children. Not the kids you meet in Diamond City or Good Neighbor, the ones born after the worst of it, growing up in a wasteland that's all they've ever known. The other children, the ones who were alive when the bombs fell, the ones who went into the vaults expecting safety. Little Lamplight in Fallout 3 exposes this in miniature. It's a settlement populated entirely by children, with a firm rule: when you turn 16, you leave. You're no longer a child, you're a mungo, an adult, and adults aren't allowed in Little Lamplight. The kids have built a functional society underground. They have governance, resource management, defense systems. They survive without adult supervision because they don't have a choice. The origin of Little Lamplight reveals the cruelty. It was a cavern system where a school group was on a field trip when the bombs fell. The teachers tried to lead the children to Vault 87 for safety, but Vault 87 was an FEV experimentation site, and the vault staff refused to let the children in, turned them away, left them to die in the wasteland. So the children went back to the caves, and they survived. For 200 years, generations of children living in those caverns, raising themselves, dying when they reach 16 and venture into the Capital Wasteland, replaced by new children born in the settlement or found wandering the wasteland after their parents died. Think about what that means. Children raising children for 2 centuries. No adults to teach them history or science or anything beyond immediate survival skills. No one to provide stability or protection beyond what the oldest kids, the 14 and 15-year-olds, can manage before they age out and have to leave. Every child in Little Lamplight knows they have a timer. They have until 16. Then they're exiled into a wasteland full of super mutants and raiders and radiation, with minimal equipment and whatever skills they've managed to learn from other kids. Most of them die within days. The few who survive become residents of Big Town, a nearby settlement populated by former Little Lamplight kids, trying desperately to build something resembling adult society, despite never having seen one function. This is what the Vault staff created when they turned away those children. Generations of kids who never got to have childhoods, who had to become warriors and leaders and parents at ages when they should have been learning and playing and being protected by adults who cared about them. But Little Lamplight is a success story compared to what happened inside the vaults. Vault 75 advertised itself as a school vault, specifically designed to shelter children and provide them with education during the nuclear crisis. Parents sent their kids there believing they were giving them the best possible chance at survival and continued learning. The children were separated from their parents immediately upon entry. The parents were told this was temporary, that they'd be reunited once everyone was settled. Instead, the parents were executed, killed systematically while their children were kept isolated in a separate section, unaware that their mothers and fathers were being murdered. The children were then subjected to extreme social and academic pressure. The vault staff, who were in on the experiment, pushed them constantly, created competitive environments designed to generate maximum stress, rewarded cruelty, and punished cooperation. The goal was to create children who were brilliant, ruthless, and completely lacking in empathy. Vault-Tec wanted to engineer a generation of super-intelligent sociopaths. The children were observed constantly, measured, tested. Those who showed too much empathy or collaboration were removed from the program. The experiment logs don't specify what removal meant, but given Vault-Tec's standards, it probably meant execution or transfer to even worse experimental conditions. Eventually, the children figured out what was being done to them. They revolted, killed the staff, and took over the vault. But by then, the damage was done. They'd been raised in an environment designed to destroy their capacity for normal human connection. The vault fell into violence. The children turned on each other. Nearly everyone died. These were kids whose parents thought they were saving them. Parents who probably died in the initial nuclear strike, never knowing that their children died too, not from radiation or bombs, but from deliberate psychological torture disguised as education. Vault 81's experiment separated families, but it reserved special cruelty for children. Kids were moved between the upper and lower sections based on research needs, meaning children were deliberately exposed to diseases and denied treatment so scientists in the upper vault could study disease progression in pediatric patients. Parents in the upper vault watched their children sicken and die in the lower vault. Parents in the lower vault watched their children in the upper vault living comfortably while they suffered. Children in both sections learned that adult protection was conditional, that parents couldn't keep them safe, that the vault determined their fate regardless of family bonds. Imagine being 7 years old in Vault 81. You get moved to the lower vault. You start getting sick. You can see your parents through the dividing barrier, can talk to them over intercom systems, but they can't reach you. They watch you deteriorate. You watch them grieve. And nobody helps because this is the experiment. Your suffering is data. How many children died like that? How many spent their final days confused and terrified, understanding enough to know? Their parents couldn't save them, but not enough to understand why. How many parents in the upper vault had to choose between conducting experiments on lower vault children to maintain their own family safety, or refusing and being moved to the lower vault themselves? The vaults created moral scenarios where parents had to choose between their own children's survival and others, where being a good parent meant being complicit in harming other people's kids, where the only way to protect your family was to stop seeing other families as fully human. And some children were born into the experiments, never knew anything else. Vault 11's children grew up in a society where annual human sacrifice was normal, where elections meant death sentences, where their parents participated in political campaigns designed to get their rivals killed. These kids never experienced actual democracy. They never learned governance as anything but murder with voting. What psychological framework do you develop when that's your normal? When you're raised in a vault where elected official means person we're going to kill this year? When political participation means choosing who deserves to die? When your entire understanding of society is built around systematic elimination of community members? Some of those children survived into adulthood, participated in the sacrifices themselves, probably had children of their own who they raised in the same system. Generational trauma doesn't even begin to cover it. This is generational horror, systematic destruction of human social instincts across multiple generations, children teaching children that killing your neighbors is how society functions. Vault 108 created the Garys through a cloning malfunction, but what happened to the original children in that vault? The ones who watched as hundreds of identical copies of Gary filled the vault, crowded them out, eventually turned violent and killed them? Those children spent their final days being hunted by an ever-growing swarm of clones who could only say one word, who moved in packs, who looked like copies of someone the children probably knew. Imagine being 10 years old, hiding in ventilation shafts while 100 Garys search for you, their identical faces appearing around every corner, their voices echoing through the vault. Gary! 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 No child should die like that. Terrified, hunted, confused about what's even happening because the adults are already dead and the Garys aren't capable of explanation. The secret vault cut content from Van Buren that's referenced in other games was designed to house children exclusively. The experiment's goal was raising kids in a completely controlled environment to study human development without parental influence. The children were cared for by robots programmed to provide physical necessities but no emotional support. Every child in that vault grew up without experiencing love, without being held when they cried, without anyone who cared about them beyond clinical observation. They had food and shelter and education, but they had no attachment, no bonding, no experience of being valued as individuals rather than specimens. Attachment disorders, reactive attachment disorder, disinhibited social engagement disorder. The psychological damage from early childhood absence of caregiving bonds is catastrophic and often permanent. Those children would have grown into adults who fundamentally couldn't form normal human relationships, who didn't understand love because they'd never experienced it, who related to others as objects or threats because that's all their development allowed. And this was deliberate. Vault-Tec designed it specifically. They wanted to study what happens when you remove parental bonding from human development. They used children as test subjects in an experiment that guaranteed severe psychological damage, and they did it to gather data for a generation ship program that was probably never going to be built anyway. Children in Vault 12 ghoulified along with the adults, but children experience ghoulification differently. Adult ghouls at least have memories of being human, of life before transformation. Children who ghoulified young have lived centuries as ghouls, aging so slowly that a child ghoul from before the war might still look 10 years old 200 years later. What is childhood like when it lasts for centuries? When you're stuck in a child's body in a child's social position but you've lived longer than most humans ever did? When wasteland adults treat you as a kid because you look like one, but you have 2 centuries of experience of watching people die, of surviving horrors that those adults can't imagine? Child ghouls are rare in the games, but they exist, and their existence raises questions about identity and development that are genuinely disturbing. Are they children or adults? Do they think like kids, or have they developed adult cognition despite frozen physical development? Can you even have a self-concept when your body doesn't match your temporal age, when you've been 10 years old longer than most civilizations last? The worst part about the children in Fallout is that they were betrayed specifically by the systems meant to protect them. Schools were supposed to keep kids safe. Vault 75 killed their parents and tortured them. Vaults were supposed to be shelters. They became laboratories. Adults were supposed to care for children. Instead, vault staff, parents, teachers all became complicit in experiments that destroyed kids physically and psychologically. Every child who went into a vault did so because adults told them it was safe. Parents reassured frightened kids that the vaults would protect them. Teachers led field trips to educational facilities that became death traps. Government and corporate advertisements promised that children would be saved, that the next generation would survive, that humanity's future was secured in underground shelters. All of it was lies. The children were never going to be saved. They were going to be used. And they were too young to understand, too dependent on adults to resist, too trusting to recognize the betrayal until it was far too late. Some of them never recognized it at all. Children raised in experimental vaults often didn't know anything was wrong, thought their horrible conditions were just how life worked, died believing that the cruelty they experienced was normal and necessary. That might be the worst part. Not the children who suffered knowing they were being hurt, but the ones who suffered without ever understanding that it didn't have to be this way. The kids who thought democracy meant human sacrifice, thought education meant torture, thought family meant watching your parents sicken while you stayed healthy, or vice versa, thought childhood meant fighting to survive every single day because adults had decided your suffering served a purpose. The wasteland is full of monuments to dead children. Not physical monuments, those don't exist, but absences. Places where children should be laughing and aren't. Schools that will never have students. Playgrounds rusted into hazards. Toys scattered through ruins, small shoes, tiny skeletons in vaults, hollow tapes of parents recording final messages to kids they'll never see again. And sometimes, very rarely, you find evidence of children who survived all of it, who made it through the experiments, the betrayals, the horror, who grew up in hell and somehow remained human enough to care about others, to try to build something better, to make sure the next generation doesn't suffer the way they did. Those children are the real heroes of Fallout. Not the player characters with their guns and power armor, the kids who survived Vault-Tec, who came out of those experiments still capable of empathy, who looked at the cruelty that shaped their entire lives and chose not to perpetuate it. They're few. They're rare. Most children who survived experimental vaults came out broken, became raiders or isolates or died shortly after emerging. But the few who retained their humanity despite everything, who chose to be kind in a world that gave them every reason to be cruel, they're proof that the experiments failed in at least one significant way. Vault-Tec couldn't completely destroy the human capacity for compassion. They tried. They designed protocols specifically to break it, to create generations of sociopaths who would follow orders without empathy. And mostly they succeeded. But not always. Not completely. Somewhere in the wasteland, there's an adult who was a child in a vault, who experienced horrors that should have destroyed their soul, and who still helps strangers, still protects the vulnerable, still believes that people deserve better than the cruelty that defined their childhood. Those individuals are the reason hope exists in Fallout, at all. Not because the world is getting better, it probably isn't, but because the absolute worst that humanity could do to its own children didn't successfully extinguish the best qualities those children possessed. The kids never had a chance, but some of them survived anyway, and that's as close to victory as the wasteland gets. The final secret, horror as system, not aberration. We've descended through layers of disturbing revelations, corporate conspiracies that may have started the war, alien shrines that make no sense, ancient entities worshipped by ghouls, artifacts that grant power and steal humanity, mysterious figures who exist across impossible timelines, government and corporate partnerships that turn survival into torture, the possibility that you yourself might be synthetic, vault experiments that destroy generations, children betrayed by every system meant to protect them, the silence of a dead world. But there's one final secret, the deepest one, the truth that all these horrors point toward. None of this was aberration. This was the system functioning exactly as designed. Pre-war America in Fallout wasn't a flawed democracy slowly corrupted by war and resource scarcity. It was an authoritarian state that had abandoned democratic principles long before the bombs fell. The government annexed Canada through military force. They deployed power armor against protesters. They allowed corporations to conduct human experimentation with government funding and protection. They built an apartheid state where wealth determined access to safety, and the poor were left to die. This wasn't corruption. This was the intended outcome of systems that valued profit and power over human welfare. The Enclave didn't hijack American democracy. They were the natural endpoint of a governance structure that concentrated power in unaccountable bureaucracies. Vault-Tec didn't pervert capitalism. They were capitalism taken to its logical conclusion, monetizing survival and turning human suffering into revenue streams. They were tremendously successful. The experiments ran for decades or centuries. Data was collected, corporate objectives were met. The fact that thousands of people suffered and died was never considered a failure because those people were never the point. They were resources, raw material for research, acceptable losses in pursuit of profit and knowledge. The Great War itself was the system working. Not a tragic mistake or a failure of diplomacy, but the inevitable result of economic structures that required constant growth, nationalist ideologies that framed everything as zero-sum competition, and military-industrial complexes that profited from escalation. Peace would have been a market failure. The bombs were a market success. Every horror we've examined exists because systems were designed to produce exactly these outcomes. The Enclave was created by government structures that allowed shadow governance. Vault-Tec was created by economic structures that rewarded sociopathic corporate behavior. The experiments were enabled by regulatory structures that placed profit above human rights. Uggy Qualtoff and the Crown and the pre-human artifacts are different. They predate these systems, but humanity's response to them is revealing. Lorenzo was imprisoned and exploited by his family for centuries. The Crown could have been studied to understand the ancient civilization that created it, but instead it was used to produce a longevity serum that benefited a wealthy family. Even encountering something genuinely alien, something that should have transformed human understanding of history and reality, America's corporate and familial power structures found ways to turn it into exploitation. The mysterious stranger might help people, but he exists in a world so broken that one man with a gun appearing occasionally constitutes miraculous intervention. His existence highlights the absence of functional institutions. There's no government protecting citizens, no social services helping the vulnerable, just a lone figure appearing and vanishing because there's nothing else. The children suffered because societies that value production over people see children as future workers first and humans second. The vaults experimented on kids because within capitalist frameworks, children are property of their parents, and parents signed contracts. The fine print said Vault-Tec could do anything. The parents didn't read it, didn't understand it, or had no choice. The system was designed to produce this outcome. The silence from the rest of the world might reflect that these systems were global. Maybe Europe and Asia and Africa all had their own versions of Vault-Tec and the Enclave. Maybe the entire planet was operating under economic and governance structures that made nuclear annihilation inevitable. Maybe there's silence because every nation destroyed itself through the same systemic failures. Because the problem wasn't America or China specifically, but the forms of organization that humanity had developed by the 21st century. Here's the horror. Fallout doesn't show us a world destroyed by monsters or aliens or supernatural evil. It shows us a world destroyed by human systems operating exactly as humans designed them to operate. Markets that required infinite growth on a finite planet. Governments that accumulated power without accountability. Corporations that pursued profit without ethical constraints. Nationalism that treated foreign populations as inherently less valuable than domestic ones. These systems didn't fail. They succeeded at their actual goals, which were never human flourishing, but rather concentration of power and extraction of value. The Great War was success for defense contractors who'd sold weapons for decades. The vaults were success for Vault-Tec, which collected payment for construction and ran SEER experiments they'd never have been allowed to run otherwise. The Enclave's survival was success for the shadow government that had positioned itself to outlast democracy. The wasteland is what success looks like when success is measured in profit and power rather than human welfare. This realization reframes every horror in the franchise. The super mutants aren't tragic accidents. They're products of military research programs that valued enhanced soldiers over the humanity of test subjects. The ghouls aren't unfortunate victims of radiation. They're evidence that Vault-Tec deliberately exposed people to radiation to study the effects. The raiders aren't random bandits. They're people responding to a world where violence became necessary for survival because all institutional support structures were designed to fail. Even the death claws, the most obviously monstrous creatures in Fallout, are human creations. Genetically engineered weapons designed by the United States military before the war. They're not alien or supernatural. They're just military-industrial complex made flesh, literalized metaphor for what happens when you design life forms for killing and then lose control of them. Everything horrible in the wasteland traces back to human decisions, human systems, human structures that incentivized cruelty and penalized compassion. The wasteland is post-apocalyptic, but the apocalypse wasn't a departure from how things were going. It was the culmination. This is why Fallout is genuinely disturbing in ways that most post-apocalyptic fiction isn't. Most apocalypse stories are about external threats, zombies, aliens, plagues, natural disasters. The horror comes from outside, and humanity bands together to survive it. Even when humans are the threat, it's usually framed as exceptional evil, dictators or mad scientists or terrorist groups. Fallout says the call is coming from inside the house. The horror is us, not exceptions, not outliers, but the ordinary function of systems we built and maintained. Vault-Tec executives who designed experiments weren't cackling villains. They were professionals doing jobs, presenting quarterly reports, managing portfolios. The Enclave leadership weren't comic book evil. They were bureaucrats and military officers following protocols. The banality of evil doesn't quite capture it. This is the systematization of evil, the incorporation and automation and bureaucratization of cruelty until it becomes just how things work. And the worst part, the final secret that makes all of this genuinely unbearable when you sit with it, is that the wasteland is still operating under these same principles. The systems destroyed themselves, but the logic survived. The NCR in New Vegas is recreating pre-war American expansion, claiming territory and displacing populations, and spreading the same corrupt governance structures that led to the apocalypse. The Brotherhood of Steel hoards technology and lets communities starve rather than sharing resources. The Institute kidnaps and experiments on people, continues the same human research programs that Vault-Tec ran. Caesar's Legion builds an empire on slavery and brutality, embracing the violence that pre-war militarism celebrated. Even the good factions replicate problematic structures. The Minutemen are better than raiders, but they're still organized around violence as primary problem-solving tool. The Railroad saves synths, but struggles to imagine society beyond perpetual resistance. No faction in any Fallout game has successfully created systems based on fundamentally different principles than the ones that caused the apocalypse. Because the survivors don't know any different. They grew up in vaults that taught them hierarchical, experimental, or authoritarian social organization. Or they grew up in the wasteland, learning that might makes right, and resources should go to whoever can take them. The ideas that created the pre-war world, the assumptions about how societies should function, those survived the bombs because they're carried in culture and consciousness, passed from generation to generation, even when the specific institutions collapse. This is the final secret, the most disturbing truth buried in Fallout's lore. The apocalypse didn't end anything. It just removed the facade. Pre-war America pretended to value democracy and freedom and human rights, while actually operating as oligarchic military state that experimented on its own citizens. Post-war wasteland is more honest. It's violent and cruel and exploitative, openly rather than through corporate and governmental structures. But the underlying logic is identical. Strong dominate weak. Resources go to whoever can claim them. Human beings are means rather than ends. Survival justifies atrocity. These weren't principles introduced by the apocalypse. They were principles that caused it. And until wasteland survivors develop genuinely different organizational principles, until someone builds a society based on cooperation rather than domination, on welfare rather than profit, on human dignity rather than power accumulation, the cycle will continue. The bombs will fall again. Maybe not nuclear bombs, maybe something else, but the same systemic drives toward concentrated power and extracted value will eventually produce another catastrophe. And survivors of that catastrophe will rebuild using the same principles, because those are the only principles they know. Horror in Fallout isn't the death clause or the radiation or the scarcity. Horror is the recognition that we built the systems that destroyed us, that we're rebuilding using the same blueprints, that we've learned nothing except new ways to hurt each other. The wasteland is a mirror, and what it reflects is that humanity's greatest threat has always been humanity's chosen forms of organization. We built structures that required catastrophe. We funded our own destruction. We signed contracts for our imprisonment. We voted for our extinction. And given the chance to start over, to build something different in the ruins, we built the same things again. Different names, same cruelty, same hierarchy, same inevitable trajectory toward collapse. That's the secret. We are the monsters. Not metaphorically, not in some abstract sense, but concretely and specifically. The systems we create, the structures we maintain, the economic and political organizations we participate in or fail to resist, those are the source of horror. Vault-Tec exists because we buy from corporations that we know exploit workers. The Enclave exists because we tolerate shadow governance and unaccountable power. The vaults exist because we accept that some people are more valuable than others, that experimentation on the powerless serves the greater good, that suffering is acceptable if it produces data or profit. Every horror in Fallout is human. Every monster is our creation. Every catastrophe is our choice, not individually, not in ways that any single person could prevent, but systemically, structurally, as emergent properties of how we've organized civilization. And that's the truth that makes Fallout genuinely disturbing rather than just entertaining post-apocalyptic fiction. It's not showing us a nightmare future that we can avoid through better choices. It's showing us the logical conclusion of choices we're making right now, systems we're maintaining right now, structures we participate in every day.